The old Du Bois residence stood at the end of Alder Street, surrounded by ancient oaks that had witnessed the rise and fall of generations. Inside the modest two-story house, Margaret Du Bois spent her morning exactly the way she had for 40 years, cataloguing, labeling, and preserving documents in her private archival room. She was quiet, methodical, and unshakably patient. Her husband, Edward, always joked that she could hide the secrets of the world in her drawers and no one would ever find them. What he didn't realize was that one day her skill would save both their lives. Their son, Adrian Du Bois, had always seen life differently. He grew up seeing their family's small business grow into moderate success, but to him it was never enough. He wanted more space, more money, more recognition. And above all, he wanted the house. The old Du Bois home, with its land, its history, its sentimental weight, felt to him like the key to the future he deserved. The problem was simple. His parents were still alive and still living in it. Adrian had become impatient over the years, frequently talking to friends about future inheritance as if it were a guaranteed investment. His parents noticed his growing sense of entitlement, but they brushed it off as youthful arrogance. They never imagined the darkness that entitlement would grow into. Things escalated the day Adrian visited with a stack of documents in hand. He entered the home as if he owned it already. His parents sat across from him in the living room as he spoke with a coldness they had never heard before. He told them they were getting too old, that the house needed new hands, and that he would be taking over its title to manage things better. Edward laughed at first, thinking it was another one of Adrian's absurd ideas. But Margaret saw something different, something calculating in her son's expression. She had archived human lives through decades of recorded stories, and she knew when someone was rewriting a narrative for their own benefit. When they refused to sign anything, the tension turned into hostility. Adrian came back the next week, then the week after that, each time angrier. Each time more determined. Eventually his frustration grew into a cruel plan, one he justified to himself with the twisted logic that they'd have to give in eventually. It happened on a cold evening just after sunset. The house was quiet, the old floorboards creaking under the weight of time. Adrian told them he had hired workers to do renovations and needed them out of the main floor for a few days. Before they realized what was happening, he ushered them toward the basement door. The moment they stepped inside, the lock clicked behind them. The dim light barely reached the lower steps as the sound of their son's voice echoed through the door. "You'll be safe down there," he said, no remorse in his tone. "Just until you're ready to sign." The silence that followed felt heavier than the darkness. Edward pounded on the door, shouting, demanding to be let out, but the basement walls swallowed the sound. Margaret, however, remained eerily calm. She walked to the old cabinet where she stored boxes from previous generations. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with certainty. She knew exactly what Adrian had forgotten. Documentation was power. Adrian, in his obsession, never once wondered why Margaret kept records of everything. Birth certificates, adoption papers, property deeds, photographs, letters, legal forms, and family lineage. Her files were a map of truth, meticulously maintained by a woman who understood that memory fades, but paper does not. She opened a slightly worn folder that she had labeled decades ago. Inside were the papers she knew would someday matter. Her husband watched as she laid them out on the dusty table, his breathing heavy from frustration and disbelief. "Margaret, what is this?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she unfolded a set of documents, each bearing signatures from long-forgotten social workers, judges, and physicians. "Adrian has forgotten one important thing," she said softly. "The Du Bois name isn't actually his." The truth was as old as Adrian's earliest childhood memory. He had been adopted at the age of 3 from a troubled family whose last name had no connection to the Du Bois heritage. Margaret and Edward had taken him in, given him everything, loved him with a depth that erased the boundaries of blood. They never told him because they didn't believe love needed documentation. But now, that documentation was everything. If Adrian wanted to claim rights over the family lineage, he needed to prove he was part of it. The papers in Margaret's hands proved the opposite. Meanwhile upstairs, Adrian had no idea what awaited him. He spent the night drafting messages to real estate agents, imagining renovations, picturing property value increases. His greed was so loud he couldn't hear the quiet storm building beneath him. The next morning, Margaret waited until she heard him leave for work. With a calmness only years of archival discipline could provide, she took out her old emergency hammer, kept for earthquakes, and shattered the smallest basement window. It wasn't big enough to climb through, but it was enough to reach the latch. After several tries, the lock clicked open. She and Edward stepped out into the cold morning light, free but furious, betrayed yet determined. They didn't go to the police immediately. Instead, they went to the town's most trusted legal advisor, a woman who had known Margaret for decades and respected her attention to detail. The moment the lawyer saw the documentation, her eyes widened. "You understand what this means, right?" she said. "He has no legal claim to your inheritance. He can't take this house. He isn't even a Du Bois by blood or by adoption law anymore. These papers show his original guardianship wasn't fully transferred." Margaret nodded. She had always known. That afternoon, before Adrian returned, legal officers accompanied the couple back home. They waited in the living room as Adrian walked in with groceries and dreams, expecting to see his parents still trapped below. Instead, he saw them sitting on the couch, calm, composed, and flanked by officials. His face went pale. Margaret slid the papers across the table, her eyes meeting his with a sadness deeper than anger. "You wanted the house," she said softly, "but you never checked who it legally belongs to." Adrian's hands shook as he scanned the documents. Each line dismantled the foundation of entitlement he had built his ego on. He wasn't the true heir. He had no legal inheritance. And worst of all, he had committed a criminal act by locking his parents in a basement over property he had no right to. He stammered, trying to explain, to blame stress, to call it a misunderstanding. But the officers stepped forward before he finished. His voice cracked into desperation as they cuffed him, but Margaret didn't look away. She didn't celebrate, she didn't cry. She simply closed the folder and placed it in her bag with the precision of someone who understood that truth was never loud, it was simply patient. The days that followed were quiet. The house felt heavier, not with fear but with the echo of choices that could never be undone. Margaret returned to her archival room, placing the adoption folder in a special drawer, not out of spite, but out of respect for the truth that had protected them. Edward sat beside her, finally understanding the depth of her work. "You saved us," he whispered. She smiled gently. "No, the truth did." And in the silence of that small room, surrounded by the weight of recorded history, Margaret knew that she had always been the guardian of her family. Not through blood, not through force, but through the power she had mastered her entire life: documentation. The quiet weapon no one sees coming until it's too late.